Okay, continuing with Christ as a symbol of the self in Jung's Ion. This is chapter 5. And we're going from paragraph 114. And what we're connecting here is Jung's been talking about this early Christian notion of evil as the privation of the good, the privatio boni. And he was talking about this early sort of Jewish Christian notion of Christ and Satan as brothers. And well, he's talking about a lot in the last video. And so what Jung wants to talk about here is like why is he so concerned with this? And I think we see that Jung is concerned for the condition of the soul, the liberation of which, or the sort of development or ascension or aspiration of which, struggling to find the right word, we saw from the first video here, is supposedly a part of Christianity, right? We saw how it was about, pursuing the Holy Grail, or there's this developmental progression where one's relationship with Christ can be seen as an asset in that way, in that process. Yeah, so it had to do with the redemption of the soul, and one's relation with Christ is intended as an aid in that process. And so now Jung is sort of arguing in that vein, in a sense, that the doctrine that evil is merely the privation of good is in some way oppressive to the soul, if we regard that only humans are the authors of evil. In some way, this compromises our capacity for redemption. And in connection with the nature of the work of re-ensoulment, which I won't recount here, this is partly why I find this interesting. I'm going to let Jung start speaking for himself. From 114, quote, "But there is still another reason why I must lay such critical stress on the privatio boni. As early as St. Basil, we meet with the tendency to attribute evil to the disposition of the soul, and at the same time to give it a non-existent character. Since, according to this author, evil originates in human frivolity, and therefore owes its existence to mere negligence. It exists, so to speak, only as a byproduct of psychological oversight. And this is such a negligible quantity that evil vanishes altogether in smoke. Frivolity as a cause of evil is certainly a factor to be taken seriously, but it is a factor that can be got rid of by a change of attitude. We can act differently if we want to. Psychological causation is something so elusive and seemingly unreal that everything which is reduced to it inevitably takes on the character of futility or of a purely accidental mistake and is thereby minimized to the utmost. It's an open question how much of our modern undervaluation of the psyche stems from this prejudice. This prejudice is all the more serious in that it causes the psyche to be suspected of being the birthplace of all evil. Okay, what is Jung saying here? So firstly, obviously he's saying that evil tends to be regarded as non-existent, originating from frivolity, and is attributed to the soul. And he's saying that yes, it's true that frivolity can be a cause of evil. Evil can be caused by negligence, but such a cause of evil can be gotten rid of by a change of attitude. The sense of freedom that we can change how we act consciously. Yes, and this is, I think, why we see this Gnostic notion that it has to do with the liberation of the soul, as in the more free we can be, then the more room there is to ameliorate and amend the human causes of evil, such as frivolity. I think we can see how that notion is then twisted into freedom as liberation from the world. Yeah, it's not about getting up and away. It's freedom to act. It's freedom to be involved. It's freedom to participate consciously. And so in this way, you was talking about how, yeah, evil is reduced to a psychological cause where the psyche is treated as the birthplace of all evil. And he thinks that this is part of the reason why we undervalue the psyche in modern times, that we have a kind of prejudice towards our own. Yeah, I should mention that the terms psyche and soul are somewhat equivalent here. So our notion of the psyche is somewhat equivalent to what Jung talks about as the soul. That really just settled into me. I just was able to just grasp for a second what it actually meant. Actually, our psyche is the soul. I hadn't quite grasped that yet. Okay, so Jung's then going to talk about what are the consequences of this prejudice. Quote, the church fathers can hardly have considered what a fatal power they were ascribing to the soul. One must be positively blind not to see the colossal role that evil plays in the world. Indeed, it took the intervention of God himself to deliver humanity from the curse of evil, for without his intervention, man would have been lost. If this paramount power of evil is imputed to the soul, the result can only be a negative inflation, a, a, a demonic claim to power on the part of the unconscious, which makes it all the more formidable. This unavoidable consequence is anticipated in the figure of the Antichrist and is represented in the course of contemporary events, whose nature is in accord with the Christian aeon of the fishes, now running to its end. Okay, what's Jung talking about? Well, he's saying firstly that this prejudice of regarding the soul as the cause of evil, even via a frivolity, is a kind of it actually exaggerates or overestimates the soul's power in a way which inflates the soul. So it attributes a kind of Jung's notion actually is that the prejudice of evil ascribed to the soul is actually a kind of unconscious claim to power on part of the unconscious. The idea being that if we're more conscious, if we can be more conscious of the evil that is within us, then we will be less inclined to attribute evil as caused by the soul. And he thinks that he thinks that when evil is imputed to the soul, that the result of that is this negative inflation, that the unconscious ends up making this sort of counteractive demonic claim as a way that if we regard the soul as evil, that sort of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that results in Jung says, and I quote, if this paramount power of evil is imputed to the soul, the result can only be a negative inflation, i.e., a demonic claim to power on the part of the unconscious, which makes it all the more formidable. This unavoidable consequence is anticipated in the figure of the Antichrist. Yeah, so the soul is empowered by this false imputation in a way which is manifestly undesirable. And the idea is that the figure of the Antichrist anticipates that and and is reflected in the course of contemporary events. And Jung feels that the nature of such events accords with the notion that there is a Christian aeon, namely the aeon of Pisces, which is coming to its end. Now let's move on. Jung, in the world of Christian ideas, Christ undoubtedly represents the self. I won't talk about what Jung means by the self. I've published extensively about that. It's a center of personality that combines conscious and unconscious elements expressed in the form of symbols of quaternity, including the cross and including mandalas. As the apotheosis of individuality, the self has the attributes of uniqueness and of occurring only once in time. Jung describes the self as the monad which I am. It's the most fateful combination of what we call individuality. So it's kind of like if we, the ego, are the earth, then the self is like the sun. So there's a footnote here that's relevant. It's been objected that Christ cannot have been a valid symbol of the self, or was only an illusory substitute for it. I can agree with this view only if it strictly refers to the present time, when psychological criticism has become possible, but not if it pretends to judge the pre-psychological age. Christ did not merely symbolize wholeness, but as a psychic phenomenon, he was wholeness. This is proved by the symbolism as well as by the phenomenology of the past, for which it be noted evil was a privatio body, a privation of the good. The idea of totality is, at any given time, as total as one is oneself. The idea of totality is at any given time as total as one is oneself. Who can guarantee that our conception of totality is not equally in need of completion? The mere concept of totality does not by any means posit it. Jung is here pointing to the idea, the notion that Christ was a symbol of totality, was a symbol of the self, but that, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's a perfectly valid symbol of totality, right? But we can also see from that consciousness, according to Jung, has developed over a couple of thousand years, and that we're an advantage point to recognize that that symbol no longer represents the totality that it once did. That we have a different notion of totality, a different notion of wholeness. So for Jung, this is saying Christ was a symbol of the self because he was a symbol of wholeness that has been effective as such for 2000 years. So in the world of Christian ideas, Christ undoubtedly represents the self as the apotheosis of individuality. The self has the attributes of uniqueness and of occurring only once in time. But since the psychological self is a transcendent concept, expressing the totality of conscious and unconscious contents, it can only be described in antinomial terms. I think there's something really tricky here. So Jung is then going to say that is the above attributes, such as he said, uniqueness occurring only once in time and transcendence. These must be supplemented by their opposites if the transcendental situation is to be characterized correctly. That means the self is most truly between transcendent and immanent. It is both. It is both unique, but also common to all. It occurs only once in time, but it is also occurring in every time. We see how Christ fits that image perfectly. He as in Jesus Christ, you know, was very much unique and occurred, the whole point of him is that he occurred in history only once in time, in real chronological time. But at the same time, we all participate in him in some way, or it's his incarnation is still occurring, it's still happening in eternal time. So the self, this is what we mean when we say that the self is transcendent. It's beyond. As a concept, it's at the limit. It can only be described in paradoxical and contradictory terms. And so Jung then does this with a couple of quaternities, which are difficult. I'm showing them. It's difficult to show because of the lighting. You can roughly see two quaternities, and I'm going to read out what they say. So this first one, yeah, so for Jung, because it's a transcendent concept expressing the totality of conscious and unconscious contents, it can only be described in antinomial terms. And we can do this most simply in the form of a quaternion of opposites, which he names unitemporal and eternal, which I would call chronos and kairos. That's on the vertical axis. And then he says unique and universal, or individual and collective, I've written. And so the idea is that Christ's archetype sort of is the convergence between the eternal and the universal, and that Christ's person is the convergence of his uniqueness and his chronology. This formula expresses not only the psychological self, but also the dogmatic figure of Christ. As an historical personage, Christ is unitemporal and unique. As God, universal and eternal. Likewise, the self, as the essence of individuality, it is unitemporal and unique. As an archetypal symbol, it is a God image and therefore universal and eternal. Now, if theology describes Christ as simply good and spiritual, then something evil and material, or chthonic, is bound to arise on the other side to represent the Antichrist. The resultant quaternion of opposites is united on the psychological plane by the fact that the self is not deemed exclusively good and spiritual. Consequently, its shadow turns out to be much less black. A further result is that the opposites of good and spiritual need no longer be separated from the whole. Okay, a couple of things here, because this is a lot, right? So Jung is sort of arguing that he was arguing first and foremost for Christ as a symbol of the self, who bears the qualities of uniqueness in chronology in his person, and of eternality or kairos and universality in his archetype, same as the self. But he then says that if theology then describes Christ or describes the self, let's say, in certain terms, without also defining it in terms of their opposites, then a figure is bound to rise up to represent those opposites. And he's saying that that's exactly what happened. That if we define Christ as good and spiritual, then the Antichrist is bound to arise to express the evil and material or chthonic. So the implication is that theology actually misjudges or misperceives Christ, and by extension also misjudges and misperceives the Antichrist. And that viewed in this way, both of them can be brought down to earth, so to speak, by proper recognition. And so he was talking about this we were talking about the sort of mutual arising if we misperceive the situation. He says that there's a resultant quaternion of opposites, which is different than the one that we were talking about. The first quaternion that we were talking about had to do with the equivalence between Christ and the self. And now he's talking about if we define Christ, he would say mistakenly as good and spiritual, and the evil and material arises in response. He says the resultant quaternion of opposites is united on the psychological plane. Because even if we define our self-image in these terms, well, Jung says that the self is not that way. It's not deemed exclusively good and spiritual. And so that means that the quaternity is on the vertical, good and evil, and on the horizontal, spiritual and material, chthonic. And so the spiritual and good on the top left converge in Christ, and the evil and material converge in Satan or the Antichrist. And so he regards that when this quaternion is united on the psychological plane, certain consequences follow. Namely, that whole quaternion has a shadow. That's what Jung would call the shadow of the self. And he thinks it's much less black, much less, not so bad in some way. And the reason for that is because more of what would be relegated to the shadow via repression is included in the quaternity. And furthermore, there's a second result, that is that that good and evil don't have to be split from each other, and material and spiritual are also not split from each other, and that they no longer need to be separated from the whole. So there's a way that when good and spiritual go up into the archetype of Christ and evil and material go up into the archetype of Satan, that both of these characters are separated from the whole in a certain way. They're regarded archetypally. And so there's a way that not only can the shadow be rehabilitated, but Christ can actually be more deeply included or involved. Both characters can be brought down to earth. This is what we mean by incarnation. Now Jung says, this quaternio characterizes the psychological self. Being a totality, it must by definition include the light and dark aspects. So it's a totality symbol. It's a symbol of the whole. And he's saying that if we admit the empirical reality of evil, if we see that there is light and darkness, good and evil, then those will necessarily be expressed in our symbol of totality, in our perception of the self. And that makes sense to me. Because being a totality, it must by definition include the light and dark aspects, in the same way that the self embraces both masculine and feminine, and is therefore symbolized by the marriage quaternio. With reference to psychology of the transference. So this last is by no means a new discovery, since according to Hippolytus, it was known to the Narcines. Narcenes, I don't know how to pronounce that, I'm sorry. Hence, individuation is a mysterium conjunctionis, the self being experienced as a nuptial union of opposite halves, and depicted as a composite whole in mandalas that are drawn spontaneously by patients. So the self is experienced as a union of opposites and depicted as such. Okay, not much to say there, so let's continue. It was known and stated very early that the man Jesus, the son of Mary, was the principium individuationis, the principle of individuation. Thus, Basilides, who lived in the 2nd century, is reported by Hippolytus as saying, quote, "Now Jesus became the first sacrifice in the discrimination of the natures, and the passion came to pass for no other reason than the discrimination of composite things. For in this manner, he says, the sonship that had been left behind in a formless state needed separating into its components in the same way that Jesus was separated." Okay, so what is this? What's Basilides trying to get at? Well, Jung is trying to express this. He says, according to the rather complicated teachings of Basilides, or Basilides, the the non-existent God begot a threefold sonship. So this is Basilides had these teachings, and he taught that God was non-existent, quote, and had three sons, and then, quote, the first son, whose nature was the finest and most subtle, remained up above with the Father. The second son, having a grosser nature, descended a bit lower, but received some such wing as that with which Plato equips the soul in his Phaedrus. The third son, as his nature needed purifying, fell deepest into formlessness. This third sonship is obviously the grossest and heaviest because of its impurity. In these three emanations or manifestations of the non-existent God, it is not hard to see the trichotomy of spirit, soul, and body. Okay, pausing. Jung's going to go on, but first of all, um, yeah, so first of all, we're talking about the teachings of Basilides, and it's in the theme. Why are we talking about this? It seems to be in the theme that it was known early on that the man Jesus was the principle of individuation. So sort of early on, he was seen to be a symbol of wholeness, and that he as a man was sort of, quote, the first sacrifice in the discrimination of the natures. And so there seems to be a kind of discriminating or separating process that's happening on a sort of human and spiritual level at the same time. It's reflected in the Passion of Christ, and then there are these teachings of Basilides, which talk about this threefold sonship derived from a non-existent Father God, a God who has the quality of non-existence. And so then we were talking about them, and then Jung is going to tie this together in a minute, but then he's talking about how these can be seen to represent spirit, soul, and body. And then he says, spirit is the finest and highest. Soul, as the ligament of spirit and body, is grosser than spirit, but has the wings of an eagle, so that it may lift its heaviness up to the higher regions. Both are of a subtle nature, both as in spirit and soul are of a subtle nature, and dwell, like the ether and the eagle, in or near the region of light, whereas the body, being dark, heavy, and impure, is deprived of the light, but nevertheless contains the divine seed of the third sonship, though still unconscious and formless. This seed is, as it were, awakened by Jesus, purified and made capable of ascension, by virtue of the fact that the opposites were separated in Jesus through the passion, i.e., through his division into four. Jesus is thus the prototype for the awakening of the third sonship, slumbering in the darkness of humanity. Okay, pausing. This is a lot, right? So we have these three sonships, the first, second, and third levels of sonship in this rather complicated teachings of Basilides that correspond to sort of higher and more refined and then grosser and less subtle layers that Jung feels obviously correspond to spirit, soul, and body. This is in Ion, and this is foreshadowing Jung's book Mysterium Coniunctionis, which goes into this in great detail. Um, so a couple of points here. So this argument is that, yeah, as in the body was the third, but then Jung says specifically the body, being heavy, dark, and impure, is deprived of the light, but nevertheless contains the divine seed of the third sonship. So the idea is that the body is the third, but it actually contains a seed of quote unquote the third sonship. So there's a way that uh, these qualities of sonship are sort of contained within spirit, soul, and body in some way. And this to me would sort of, I mean, this goes along with this Judaic Christian early notion of Christ and Satan as brothers, where Satan was the eldest and first, and Christ was the second and younger. I've contrasted this in other places. I gave an example in episode 20 in the psychological type series, which is called Sometimes a Wild God, from that's a poem by Tom Hirons about drawing from Steiner a bit. The notion is that one way of getting out of this split between Christ and Lucifer is to recognize that the principle of evil can actually itself be divided into two, the third being the Zoroastrian deity Ahriman. And when I won't go into the qualities of Ahriman as distinct from Lucifer here, but the point is that Christ in some way mediates between them, and that Ahriman has a sort of third perspective, that the three of them sort of hold each other in balance in a certain way. And that um, if you use a trinity of those figures, then this sort of prevents either one of the two from being relegated to either good or evil. And so to me, this is what I would connect. So I would connect, this isn't done explicitly by Jung, but to me, I see not only first, second, and third levels of sonship, and not only spirit, soul, and body, but also in a way, Lucifer, Christ, and Ahriman. And so there's a way that I feel that the body corresponds to the fourth, out of which contains the quite divine seed of the third sonship, and that by being conscious of Ahriman, we, and I would say by being conscious as Ahriman in this context, that all three of them can be incarnated and their relationships managed more sustainably. And importantly, there's something specific here. Earlier, we were talking about the ascension of the soul. And we were talking about the relationship with Christ as an asset in that process. I think in talking about the means by which the soul may ascend, the relationship with the body becomes important. Where there's a way that I think, if I'm right, in Mysterium Coniunctionis, the idea is that the soul is sort of awakened in some way, arises or goes up with the spirit, and then comes back down to reinfuse the body in some way. So then I can see here it says spirit is the finest and highest. Soul, as the ligament of spirit and body, is grosser than spirit, but has the wings of an eagle, so that it may lift its heaviness up to the higher regions. Both are of a subtle nature, and dwell, like the ether and the eagle, in or near the region of light. whereas the body, being heavy, dark, and impure, is deprived of the light, but nevertheless contains the divine seed of the third sonship, though still unconscious and formless. Quote, this seed is, as it were, awakened by Jesus. So the divine seed of the third sonship is awakened by Jesus in the body, purified and made capable of ascension by virtue of the fact that the opposites were separated in Jesus through the passion, i.e., through his division into four. So Christ's passion was his separation into four, namely the four of physical, spiritual, social, and theological. So his life was separated from his body on the physical plane. His spirit was separated from God on the spiritual plane. Socially, he was separated from everyone, and theologically, the old was separated from the new covenant. And so Christ's passion is this separation into four. And so the idea is that the sacrifice of Christ, um, because of the fact that these opposites were separated in him through the passion, he is a kind of it, as Jung says, Jesus is thus the prototype. Jesus is the prototype for the awakening of the third sonship, slumbering in the darkness of humanity. So this is the idea here is that if we understand the common goal of these traditions to be the liberation of the soul or redemption of the soul in some way, we're disagreeing as to the process, as to the how to do that process. Well, part of the idea would be that we can in some way try to incarnate these three different principles more deeply, and that this battle between light and darkness that we see constellated in the mythology of Christianity is in some way the process of the relationship between spirit and soul and their ascension to this higher plane, this plane of spiritual warfare. They sort of it's quite high up, this it's disconnected from material conditions in some way. The idea being that if their conflict is then brought back down toward the body, the quote divine seed of the third sonship, which I've represented in the character of Ahriman, well, Steiner did, that is awakened by Jesus in the body, that Jesus and that relationship with him could serve as an awakening force, not just by example, but also through relationship with him, and particularly through his passion, through his division into four. He is a kind of prototype. So the idea being that the awakening of the third sonship slumbering in the darkness of humanity, particularly in the body, may adhere to the same form in some way as the revelation of Christ because of his prototypical nature. He is the quote, spiritual inner man. Complicated, right? Then Jung says he is also a complete trichotomy in himself. And so Jung is now going to mention these three layers of the Christ archetype. And so we've got quite a lot of different threes and fours going on. So we talked about this first, second, and third son through Basilides. We talked about Lucifer, Christ, and Ahriman. That was through Steiner. We talked about spirit, soul, and body, which is Jung's inference from Basilides and present all through these traditions. We also then talked about, no, that was it, sorry. We talked about all of that in connection with sort of what we're trying to do as in the liberation or redemption of the soul. This is kind of the relevance to me, and how Christ as a, sorry, Jesus as a prototype through his passion, his division into four: physical, spiritual, social, theological. Now, Jung is also saying, in addition, Jesus is also something more. He is a complete trichotomy in himself. Not only does he have the capacity to awaken the third sonship slumbering in the darkness of humanity in our body, in the body, but he's also a complete trichotomy. What does Jung mean? He says, for Jesus, son of Mary, represents the incarnate man, but his immediate predecessor is the second Christ, the son of the highest archon of the Hebdomad, group of seven. And his first prefiguration is Christ, the son of the highest archon of the Ogdoad, group of eight, the demiurge Yahweh. Okay. Um, so you're sort of talking about a certain notion that there are sort of three layers to this Christ archetype, that there are three Christs in some way that fit within the same archetype. I'm trying to work out where he's drawing that from. It seems to be a text called Elenkos, and I'm trying to work out who is the author of that text. Give me one second. Got it. It's from Hippolytus. So Hippolytus text, refutation of all heresies. Um, I guess Elenkos is a subset of that or something. Okay. No. Sorry, it just described Christ as these three layers of Christ that in some way, yeah, so the first and sort of lowest layer is Jesus, the son of Mary, the incarnate, but then there's sort of Christ of the Hebdomad or group of seven, and Christ of the Ogdoad or group of eight. And I don't know a lot about what this means, and frankly, I'm not at the moment interested enough to go into it. So, see, to me, it's simply another three. We had first, second, and third sonship through Basilides, and then these three layers of Christ through, I guess, Hippolytus, and we had spirit, soul, and body, and I added Lucifer, Christ, and Oman. Seven and eight is obviously also important, sort of corresponding to three and four. There's a kind of equivalent problems in all this, but I won't go into that either. So Jung says, in relation to this trichotomy of Christ figures, this trichotomy of anthropos figures corresponds exactly to the three sonships of the non-existing God, and to the division of human nature into three parts: spirit, soul, and body, is what we were just talking about. So then he says we then therefore have three trichotomies, which I already laid out. And then he says, so three trichotomies, three threes. All right. Then he says, it is in the sphere of the dark, heavy body that we must look for the, insert Greek word, that we must look for the formlessness, wherein this third sonship lies hidden. Okay, so this is a certain idea. This is the idea that there is a third sonship that is yet to be awakened and that completes or rebalances this conflict between opposites that we see reflected in Christian mythology in the battle between Christ and Lucifer, and that we have a pretty good idea of what to do. That Christ has a key role in awakening that third sonship that it is awakened by Christ in the body, awakened by Jesus in the body. Excuse me. Um, okay. So then Jung says, as suggested above, this formlessness, the sort of dark, heavy body, this formlessness seems to be practically the equivalent of unconsciousness. Wow. So again, this has to do with the symbolic significance of the numbers three and four, where four is sort of connected with the Great Mother, it's connected with the void, with unconsciousness, with formlessness, with the feminine, with the empty vessel. yin qualities. And the third is more connected, like the four is connected with the shape of a square, whereas the three is sort of the masculine logos. Its symbol is the pyramid or triangle. It's about transcendence, and it's about consciousness and masculinity. And so the idea here is that there's a way that by there's a way that in this text is trying to solve this problem of three and four by coming from the point of view of the conscious three down to the unconscious four. And that from the point of view of our consciousness, if we look down toward the body, that quote unquote the third sonship lies hidden. And so we see here that there's an equivalence between the body and the unconscious in terms of the symbolic category that I've connected with the number four. That's derived from psychology and alchemy and elsewhere. And we see that reflected in the proliferation of physical therapies ever since Jung and before him. I mean, I'm reading at the moment this book, which is called Trauma and the Body, a sensory motor approach to psychotherapy by Pat Odgin, who's citing Pierre Genet, who was writing, around the time that Jung was alive, and it was the generation before Jung, and talking about, you know, the importance of the body in therapy. And we've really come to appreciate this more and more. I mean, we find this in all kinds of other healing traditions other than our own. It's been so mental, even around Jung's time, right? And so the idea of the equivalence, the correspondence between the unconscious and the body is well substantiated. It's by working with the body that we work with the unconscious. It's not that one cannot work with the unconscious if one doesn't work with the body, but there's a strong overlap in those conceptions. The thing is, we don't want to take the notion of body too literally because I was talking elsewhere about the mycelial extended unconscious. And so when we understand that unconscious in a transjective way, then it's not simply just our literal physical body that is within in some way. It's actually the extended body. And so this is why looking down at the world here around us and among us, just as much as within our physical body. This is what I think the right orientation is. There's a lot here. Wow. Okay, so let's continue. He's about to finish this section. So then he says, it is in the sphere of the dark, heavy body that we must look for the formlessness wherein the third sonship lies hidden. As suggested above, sorry, he's saying something quite specific. He's saying looking within the sphere of the body for a formlessness, within the body. Sorry, in the sphere of the dark, heavy body, there is a formlessness. And he says, wherein that third sonship lies hidden. So there is a within within the sphere of the body, there is a formlessness, and within that formlessness, there is a third sonship. And it seems that the formlessness is the practical equivalent of the unconscious. Sorry, he says practical equivalent of, quote, unconsciousness. So the idea is that by firstly looking within the sphere of the body and looking within the unconsciousness within the body to find the third sonship, um, which is a kind of, I don't know, divine spark of awakening or consciousness or something like that. I shouldn't speak so dismissively, but anyway, it's a lot, right? I'm just trying to sort of get through this. Oh, I wanted to mention here, yeah, there was an interesting in the connection of we're talking about the passion. and Christ's division into four, by which he served as a prototype for this awakening process that we're discussing. The prototype says, I must say a word, sorry, the prototype, the footnote says, um, I must say a word here about the Horos doctrine of the Valentinians in Irenaeus, again, who was an early Christian father. Horos, or boundary, is a, quote, power or numen identical with Christ, or at least proceeding from him. It has the following synonyms: boundary fixer, he who leads across, emancipator, redeemer, and cross. So it's a power or numen identical with Christ, or at least proceeding from him. So it's sort of something that Christ can do, or something that comes from Christ. This, which is horos or boundary, and it's a power that has to do with the following synonyms of boundary fixing, he who leads across, emancipator, redeemer, and cross. In this capacity, he is the regulator and mainstay of the universe, like Jesus. But we were talking about Jesus, so I guess that's as in we were talking about Christ, and that's like Jesus. So both Jesus and Christ are regulator and mainstay of the universe. Right? Then he says, when Sophia was, quote, formless and shapeless as an embryo, Christ took pity on her, stretched her out through his cross, and gave her form through his power, so that at least she required substance. He also left behind for her an intimation of immortality. The identity of the cross with Horos, or with Christ, is clear from the text. So there's an identity between these different qualities, which are, or figures, which are Christ, Horos, and the cross. They're sort of converging in the same way. Right. So he says this is clear from the text, an image that we also find in Paulinus of Nola, who says, Christ reigns over all things as God, who on the outstretched cross reaches out through the four extremities of the wood to the four parts of the wide world, that he may draw unto life the peoples from all lands. Sort of demonstrating this convergence. Okay, so this is super interesting. It's like the notion that Sophia, capital Sophia, wisdom, the feminine principle, is has a formless and shapeless quality as an embryo, and that Christ takes pity on her and stretches her out through his cross. So in Christ's uh, incarnation, through his crucifixion, through his passion, he gives form to Sophia through his power, so that she at least acquires substance. He left behind for her an intimation of immortality. And so I would say that this goes into the symbolism and qualities associated with this, with Christ's passion, that were taken as the prototype for the awakening of the third sonship, slumbering in the darkness of humanity in the formless unconsciousness of the body. And now we're trying to finish this section because this was a lot, right? So we're going to finish this section, which is a couple more paragraphs, and then I'll come back to give Jung's conclusions. Again, it is in the sphere of the dark, heavy body that we must look for the formlessness wherein the third sonship lies hidden. As suggested above, this formlessness seems to be practically the equivalent of unconsciousness. G. Quispel has drawn attention to the concepts of a couple of Greek terms that are found in Epiphanius and Hippolytus, which are best translated as unconscious. So he gives three different Greek terms drawn from both of those authors, and that he says terms one, two, and three all refer to the initial state of things, to the potentiality of unconscious contents, aptly formulated by Basiliades as the non-existent, the many-formed, and the all-empowering seed of the world. Okay, so just to say, I would connect this with the kind of prima materia from alchemy. This is the initial state of things. And I would connect this with this. These are all qualities of in connection with the unconscious. So there's a way that we're going toward the body, toward formlessness, toward the unconscious. And what do we find there? Well, we find the initial state of things as they are. So we find things simply as they are. We find the potentiality of those unconscious contents. We also find the non-existent, what is not there. We also find that which is many-formed, and also the all-empowering seed of the world, whatever that's supposed to mean. And so these are all qualities of the third sonship related to the body and to matter, all connected with the term unconscious. And I've tried to pick up on the sense of 4E unconsciousness, mycelial extended unconsciousness. Okay, then Jung says, we're really close to the end here. This picture of the third sonship has certain analogies with the medieval filius philosophorum and the filius macrocosmi. That's the philosopher's son and the son of the macrocosm, son of the philosopher, son of the macrocosm, who also symbolize the world soul slumbering in matter. Okay, so there are analogies between this picture of the third sonship and these qualities which symbolize the world soul slumbering in matter, which we see throughout Gnosticism and elsewhere. Okay, even with Basilides, the body acquires a special and unexpected significance, since in it and its material is lodged a third of the revealed Godhead. This means nothing less than that matter is predicated as having considerable numinosity in itself. And I see this as an anticipation of the mystic significance which matter subsequently assumed in alchemy and later on in natural science. Okay, so this is super important. This is saying there's a significance which is a numinous significance to this symbolic category of which we're speaking, which includes such phenomena as the body, as the unconscious, as the world soul, as this picture of the third sonship. And it acquires this, it also of matter, right? And that matter acquires this numinous significance that we treat it as something to investigate, as something to probe, to relate with, to try to understand. This is Jung's argument. This is a whole unconscious dream that we've been engaged in. So these Gnostic analogies, and then he says, from a psychological point of view, it is particularly important that Jesus corresponds to the third sonship. This would be differing from what I was talking about earlier, in which, if I'm correct, then Jesus would correspond with the second sonship and Ahriman with the third. But in any case, Jung says, from a psychological point of view, it is particularly important that Jesus corresponds to the third sonship. And is the prototype of the awakener. Because the opposites, no, sorry, I've messed that up. So it says it's particularly important that Jesus corresponds to the third sonship. It doesn't say that he is the third sonship. But the importance is in the correspondence. And the reason for that, and sorry, he says not only is it important that corresponds to the third sonship, but that he's also the prototype of the quote awakener. He is the prototype of the awakener because the opposites were separated in him through the passion and so became conscious. So again, we saw that how these opposites were split in Christ's passion. Furthermore, Whereas in the third sonship itself, they remain unconscious so long as the latter is formless and undifferentiated. So I think this is another way of saying, I think that what he's saying here is that the human Jesus actually represents the third sonship. So there's a way that so Christ is the second sonship if we take Lucifer to be the first, and that the human Jesus in some way corresponds to the third. So there's a way that Christ and Antichrist, they sort of are consolated by the separation of opposites that come through Christ, whereas in the unconscious, in the body, in the formlessness, these opposites remain undifferentiated. Then Jung says, I'm just going to read the quote again. It says, from a psychological point of view, it's particularly important that Jesus corresponds to the third sonship and is the prototype of the awakener, because the opposites were separated in him through the passion, and so became conscious, whereas in the third sonship itself, they remain unconscious, so long as the latter is formless and undifferentiated. This amounts to saying that in unconscious humanity, there is a latent seed that corresponds to the prototype Jesus. Just as the man Jesus became conscious only through the light that emanated from the higher Christ and separated the natures in him, so the seed in unconscious humanity is awakened by the light emanating from Jesus and is thereby impelled to a similar discrimination of opposites. This view is entirely in accord with the psychological fact that the archetypal image of the self has been shown to occur in dreams when no such conceptions exists in the conscious mind of the dreamer. Okay, that's it. And this is to say a couple of things to round this out. Firstly, that these many opposites were awakened in Christ through the passion, through his division into a quaternity, through his crucifixion. However, in this third sonship which we're discussing, they remain unconscious. And there's a way that Jung is saying, just in the same way that the quote higher Christ awakened Jesus by separating the natures in him, so Jesus himself serves as a kind of prototype that through relationship with him, um, so the seed in unconscious humanity is awakened by the light emanating from Jesus and is thereby impelled to a similar discrimination of opposites. Okay, so humanity is unconscious, so we're regarding ourselves in the position of the four, the body. We regard ourselves as the feminine, as Sophia, as the body, as formlessness, and that by relationship with the man Jesus, um, there is an awakening process which is possible. So, yes, finally, the idea that yes, humanity is unconscious, we're containing a seed that corresponds to the man Jesus in some way, and hence, yep, that Jesus became conscious through Christ, which separated the natures in him, which are nevertheless unified, and that we become conscious through Christ, and that this accords with the spontaneous manifestation of images of the self, symbols of the self, which are participatory. Damn, well, that was a lot, hey? That was wild. Well, we got up to paragraph 120 from 114, so that was like 6 paragraphs. But that was the most dense part of the text. And then Jung rounds this out with a conclusion, and that clarifies his position. And that's what I'm going to come back to.